By 8:15 a.m., 40 cars sat backed up along a single-lane gravel road with nowhere to go, drivers leaning on horns while a survey crew worked calmly behind a locked gate that rancher Nathaniel Hollis had every legal right to close. HOA President Corinne Ashworth stood at the front of the line in her robe and slippers, phone pressed to her ear, telling a sheriff's dispatcher that a neighbor had trapped an entire subdivision and needed to be arrested immediately. Nate didn't raise his voice. He simply held up a folder thick with certified mail receipts and a 45-day-old notice bearing Corinne's own signature, and waited for the sheriff to arrive and read it for himself. Stay with Nate as one legally noticed road closure unravels into a scheme that had far less to do with a survey crew blocking traffic, and far more to do with what Corinne Ashworth didn't want that survey to find. Nathaniel Hollis was 46 years old, a fourth-generation rancher who had spent his whole life on the same 900 acres his great-grandfather had homesteaded, land that predated Belhaven Ridge, the subdivision built decades later along his eastern boundary, by nearly a century. When the subdivision went in, the developer had negotiated a permanent recorded easement across a narrow strip of Nate's land for the neighborhood's only road access, an easement that had always included a standard clause allowing the landowner to close the road for up to 24 hours for maintenance or survey work, provided written notice was given at least 30 days in advance. Nate's father had died the previous winter, and his final wish had been simple: place the ranch into a permanent conservation easement so it could never be subdivided or sold off for development, the way so much land around it already had been. Finalizing that easement required a fresh, certified boundary survey, a full day's work, requiring the access road gate closed to keep survey equipment and vehicle traffic from interfering with the cruise readings along that exact stretch of road. Nate had done everything by the book. 45 days before the closure, he sent the HOA board formal written notice by certified mail, addressed directly to Corinne Ashworth as board president, exactly as the easement required. The signed return receipt came back within a week, Corinne's own signature clearly on it. What Nate didn't know was that Corinne had never forwarded that notice to a single resident, never posted it on the community board, and never mentioned it once in any HOA newsletter or meeting between the day she signed for it and the morning the gate actually closed. Corinne Ashworth was 50 years old, a former hospitality executive who had run Belhaven Ridge's board for 4 years with a firm hand and an even firmer sense of her own authority. What most residents didn't know was that Corinne had spent the past several months quietly negotiating with an outside developer, a man named Preston Dale, about carving a second access road through a different, unrelated stretch of Nate's ranch entirely, a plan that would open dozens of new buildable lots along Belhaven's northern edge and net Corinne a substantial consulting fee once the deal closed, a fact she had disclosed to no one on the board. When the gate closed that morning exactly as noticed, Corinne saw an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. Dozens of frustrated, delayed residents lined up behind her made for a far more sympathetic audience than a quiet HOA board meeting ever could, and she dialed 911 within minutes of the gate closing, describing the situation in the most alarming terms she could manage: an illegal blockade, residents trapped, a hostile neighbor who needed to be removed by force. Sheriff Roland Whitlock had policed this county for 18 years and knew Nate Hollis personally, the way most longtime residents did, but he approached the scene professionally regardless, asking Nate directly whether the road closure had been authorized. Nate handed over the folder without a word: the recorded easement, the certified notice, the signed return receipt with Corinne's own signature on it, dated 45 days earlier. Corinne, standing a few feet away, insisted loudly that she had never received any such notice, that this was clearly forged, and that Nate had manufactured the paperwork after the fact to justify an act of retaliation over an unrelated property dispute. Sheriff Whitlock held up the certified mail receipt, turned it so she could see it clearly, and asked her, evenly, whether that was her signature at the bottom. Corinne's answer came a full 3 seconds too late to sound convincing. Several residents standing nearby had phones out recording the exchange, and one of them, a retired schoolteacher named Opal Winters who had lived in Belhaven Ridge since it was built, spoke up loudly enough for the whole line of cars to hear, asking Corinne directly why the board had never once mentioned a scheduled survey closure in any newsletter, when Corinne had clearly known about it for over a month. With the paperwork confirmed legitimate and no crime evident, Sheriff Whitlock declined to take any action against Nate, told the gathered residents the closure would end on schedule at the agreed time, and suggested, pointedly, in front of the crowd, that Corinne might want to explain to her own board why a properly noticed closure had somehow become a surprise to everyone standing in that line. Survey crew lead Miles Prentice finished his measurements by early afternoon, exactly within the 24-hour window Nate had noticed, and the gate reopened precisely on schedule. But Nate, still unsettled by how aggressively Corinne had escalated something so easily verified, asked Miles to send him the full boundary data once it was finalized rather than just the summary report. Rattled by the public confrontation and worried about what else Corinne might do, Nate consulted a property attorney named Vanessa Cho, who had handled his father's estate matters and now the conservation easement filing. When Nate described the incident, Vanessa's first question wasn't about the sheriff at all. It was whether Nate had ever heard of a developer named Preston Dale, a name she'd recently seen attached to a permit inquiry filed against a parcel bordering Nate's northern property line. Vanessa pulled county permitting records and found that Preston Dale's firm had filed a preliminary site inquiry 8 weeks earlier for a proposed 40-lot expansion requiring new road access. Access that, according to the engineering sketch attached to the filing, would need to cross directly through part of Nate's ranch that had nothing to do with the current subdivision's existing easement at all. Vanessa laid the sketch beside a map of the closure notice date and tapped both with a pen. "Look at the timing," she said. "Preston Dale's inquiry goes in, 6 weeks pass, and then suddenly your legally noticed survey closure turns into a 911 call and a public spectacle. That's not a coincidence, Nate. That's someone trying to make you look unreasonable right when your credibility mattered most. Right before you'd need the county's cooperation to finalize your father's easement." Nate sat with that for a long moment, turning the idea over. He'd assumed Corinne's outburst at the gate was simple pettiness. It had never occurred to him that it might have been strategy. Vanessa's paralegal spent the following week requesting every piece of correspondence between the HOA office and Preston Dale's firm under the state's public records provisions that applied to HOA governing documents. Most of what came back was routine and unremarkable, until a single email surfaced, sent from a personal account rather than Corinne's official HOA address, thanking Preston for being patient while the road access issue resolves itself, and confirming she'd keep pushing the board in the right direction. It was dated 2 days after Nate's certified notice had arrived in Corinne's mailbox. When Vanessa formally requested Belhaven Ridge's official board meeting minutes to check whether the board had ever discussed the road closure, what came back was a set of minutes dated 3 weeks before the closure, claiming the board had voted to reject Nate's notice and instructed Corinne to handle the matter directly. Minutes that didn't match any calendar entry, weren't signed by the required second board officer, and that 2 actual board members, when quietly contacted, said they had never seen or approved. Miles Prentice's finalized boundary survey confirmed something neither Nate nor Vanessa had expected. Belhaven Ridge's clubhouse parking lot, expanded 2 years earlier under Corinne's own presidency, encroached nearly 11 feet onto Nate's property along the shared boundary, meaning the HOA had been using, paving, and charging residents assessment fees partly tied to land it had never actually owned. Vanessa arranged a meeting with the full HOA board, laying out the forged minutes, the undisclosed consulting arrangement with Preston Dale, and the survey confirming the parking lot encroachment, all in one sitting. Corinne insisted at first that the minutes were simply drafted early by mistake, until Vanessa produced Preston Dale's own permit filing correspondence, which referenced Corinne's continued cooperation and her percentage in writing. The board members who had unknowingly signed off on the forged minutes were furious to learn they'd been used to manufacture a paper trail justifying a manufactured 911 emergency, and voted that same evening to suspend Corinne's presidency pending a full independent review, appointing Opal Winters, the retired schoolteacher who had spoken up at the gate, as interim board chair. One longtime board member, a quiet man named Desmond Faraday who had served alongside Corinne for 3 years, admitted in the meeting that he'd always signed whatever minutes were placed in front of him without reading them closely, trusting Corinne's summary of what had been discussed. "I think a lot of us did that," he said. "That's how she got away with it as long as she did." Opal, taking her seat as interim chair for the first time, said the board's very first order of business under new leadership would be requiring every set of minutes to be read aloud and confirmed by at least 2 members before filing. A small procedural change that, everyone in the room understood, should have existed years earlier. Nate, on Vanessa's advice, filed a civil suit against Corinne personally for the encroachment, defamation over her false 911 report, and interference with the conservation easement filing, while the county attorney's office opened a separate criminal review into the forged board minutes and the undisclosed developer arrangement. Facing both, Corinne agreed to a settlement rather than risk trial, personal financial restitution to Nate covering legal costs and encroachment damages, formal removal from any future HOA leadership role in the county, and full disclosure to residents of the Preston-Dale arrangement, which collapsed entirely once made public. When every figure was totaled, the settlement and associated penalties against Corinne reached $740,000. Belhaven Ridge's new leadership under Opal Winters negotiated a formal agreement with Nate acknowledging the parking lot encroachment, paying fair market compensation for the disputed strip of land going forward, and establishing a permanent written notification protocol requiring any communication from Nate about the shared easement to be posted directly to residents within 48 hours, removing any single board member's ability to sit on information again. The Preston-Dale expansion project was quietly withdrawn once the story became public, and no new road was ever cut through Nate's northern pasture. 6 months later, Nate stood at the same gate where the whole conflict had started, this time watching a county land trust officer place the final signature on his father's conservation easement, making it permanent, binding, and unbreakable for as long as the land existed. Opal Winters, there as a courtesy on behalf of the new board, shook his hand and told him she was glad the ranch would stay exactly as it was. Nate looked out over the pasture his family had worked for 4 generations and thought that his father had been right about something he'd said more than once. That the people who shout the loudest about being wronged are sometimes the ones with the most to hide behind that shouting, and that the truth, like a boundary line, tends to hold its ground long after the noise around it has gone quiet. If you've ever had someone try to weaponize against you, leave a comment below. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it ended. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.